Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Ahsoka Season 1, Episode 1 and 2. I believe Episode 1 is called Master and Apprentice and Episode 2 is called Toil and Trouble. So I'll have to start with a spoiler warning for Ahsoka up to Season 1, Episode 2. If you have not seen up to this point, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. Now, I heard somewhere that this was called a limited series, so some people may question my use of Season 1, but you can still call something Season 1 even if there isn't going to be Season 2, and you don't know there's not going to be a Season 2. They're even talking about doing a Season 2 of Obi-Wan for all you know, so I don't know. I'm just going to call it Season 1 because it's easier to do so. Anyway, I've been very highly anticipating this show. This has been the Star Wars show I've been looking forward to for several years now. In fact, it's funny because I was reading this comment on the review for this show, and they were like, oh, this show's I'm just watching it as a placeholder until Andor Season 2 comes on, which is really funny because that's the exact thing I said about Andor. I don't really care about this boring show. I'm just watching it as a placeholder until Ahsoka comes on. So that's my perspective. Also, I was not a huge fan of the Clone Wars or Rebels. I did not watch them when they first aired. In fact, I binge watched both shows a little over a year ago. Well, I was doing it one season per month, so it took me over about a year or so to go through both shows. So yeah, I didn't have this huge attachment to the character of Ahsoka, even though I was aware of her. But to be honest, I have been looking forward to the show even before I watched Clone Wars or Rebels, because just based off of Rosario Dawson's appearance as Ahsoka in The Mandalorian Season 2. When I first saw that episode, I had a passing familiarity with Ahsoka. I've heard of that character. And I think I actually saw the Clone Wars movie years ago when it first came out, but didn't think much of it. But I didn't really know anything about her, and yet just based off that one episode and that one guest appearance, I was like, this looks like a really awesome character. I loved that episode, even though I had no prior attachment to that character, and I was like, just based off of Rosario Dawson's performance, I'm like, this is a great character. This seems like it would be an awesome show. I really, really want to see it. Now, as you can imagine, my desire to see this show only increased after watching Clone Wars and Rebels, especially Rebels, as in many cases people were saying that this is pretty much, some people call it the 5th season of Rebels, which I think is not entirely accurate. I think it would be more accurate to say it's a sequel to Rebels. But it's definitely, Rebels ended in a cliffhanger, and it's definitely carrying off from that cliffhanger and trying to resolve it finally. Thankfully, I didn't have to wait as many years as some people did, because I just finished watching Rebels pretty much almost exactly a year ago. And I loved Rebels. That was actually my favorite. I liked it better than the Clone Wars. It was more sort of consistently good. Although nothing can be as good as the last 4 episodes of the Clone Wars. That was absolutely amazing. But then when the trailers for this show started coming out, I got super, super excited. Again, it was the one thing I've been waiting for this whole time. So the question is, now that I've seen the first 2 episodes, and mind you, it's only the first 2 episodes, so we still have 6 more to go. What did I think of it, and did it live up to my high expectations that I was, been expecting so long? And the answer is yes. It absolutely did. It was everything I wanted. Now, again, we still have 6 more episodes, so maybe it's going to falter a bit and not live up to those expectations every time. Although I still think that overall this show will. But those first 2 episodes definitely did. Now, there's a few things I want to address. First is I saw varying opinions on whether this show is accessible to those who haven't seen Clone Wars and Rebels. And I have seen some people, even some people who haven't seen Rebels and Clone Wars, saying that yes, it is. That it was easy to follow, that they didn't need that backstory. But then you have other people saying that they felt no attachment to any of the characters because they hadn't seen Clone Wars Rebels, so they would describe it as required viewing, and some critics even referred to this as, a project just for the diehards that are familiar with these other Star Wars projects and kind of alienating of wider Star Wars audiences, which actually I've heard those same criticisms levied at season 3 of The Mandalorian, which, by the way, I seem to like a lot better than most people did. And in this case, I'm not going to say I disagree because I see that perspective, but let me put it to you this way. Of course, it'd be hard for me as someone who has seen Clone Wars and Rebels to imagine what it would have been like for someone who hadn't, but I think I can, because the analogy that I would draw is when I watched the movie Serenity. Now, the movie Serenity was based off of the show Firefly. But I had never even heard of Firefly. I had never seen it, never even heard of it, didn't even know it existed. I just saw a sci-fi spaceship movie at on DVD at the video store, and I was like, oh, this might be interesting, and I rented it, watched it, loved it, and I didn't think I needed to know Firefly. I didn't even know what it was, and I didn't even know this was based off of another show when I watched it, and I didn't need to in order to enjoy the movie. However, it was extremely obvious to me that this was based off of something. At first I thought it was a book because I didn't realize it was a TV show, but it was obvious to me that the movie was expecting you to be familiar with these characters and be like, oh, we're going to meet up with Book. And when the characters say that, it's like they expect the audience to be like, oh, Book, oh, it'd be great to see him. Whereas, I had never even heard of this. I was like, who the hell is Book and why should I care? And so I had this feeling of like the movie was expecting you to be familiar with these characters already, and I wasn't. And that didn't hinder my enjoyment of the movie because the plot of the movie was pretty well self-contained. Like, it's not like something like, I think, the X-Files movie, which I think you do kind of have to know what's going on in the X-Files in order to get that movie, and you're not going to follow the plot as well if you don't. And it's not like a sequel of a movie like Part 4 or whatever, where you really need to see the first 3 parts to follow the plot and know what's going on. It was pretty well self-contained movie in the plot and everything itself. It's just you had this strong sense that they were expecting you to already be familiar with these characters in situation when you weren't, so it was very obvious that it was based off something. As I said, I didn't even know it was based off something. It was some random movie I was watching, and I could tell just by watching it that it was based off something. And so that's why I think I can understand what fans who have never seen Clone Wars and Rebels are experiencing, because I get the same exact vibes here with the first 2 episodes of Ahsoka. Now, of course, I do know what's going on, But I could definitely see it being this same situation that I had, the same experience I had with Serenity, because I think the plot is pretty well self-contained, even though it is kind of a conclusion to the ending of Rebels. They do a really good job of explaining that. They have the opening crawl at the start. They introduce the characters that are relevant to the show. They do a very specific exposition about who Ezra was and what happened to him, and that the whole point is trying to find him. So even if you've never seen Rebels, you have no idea who Ezra is, and you have no idea who Thrawn is. These episodes do give you enough to be sort of self-contained and not require you to have seen the other shows. However, just like in my Serenity example, I could definitely see that they expect you to be familiar with these characters, and I can get where that one critic was coming from, saying I had no connection to these characters whatsoever because I had never heard of them. I think the episode does presuppose familiarity with these characters, particularly Ahsoka, Sabine, and Hera. Is trying to remember her last name, but anyway, and so I could see some people who hadn't seen Rebels feeling lost, especially if they hadn't seen the Clone Wars either. But I don't think it's like an inside thing just for the diehards. That I disagree with, because as I said, I think the plot is very self-contained. And that you don't necessarily need to see those shows. It gives you a bit of a head up. But yeah, again, I'm not dismissing those who said they didn't care for this show very much because they hadn't seen those shows. I get that. But I know for me, as I said, since I was so highly anticipating the show even before I saw those cartoons, I'm pretty sure had I not seen those cartoons yet, I would still appreciate the show just as much. It would probably just motivate me even more to go watch those cartoons, and I think a lot of people may have that response where by watching this they're highly motivated to go and find out the backstory here. So I think I love these first two episodes. I've heard the opinion of some people saying that it just takes too long to set up and it takes too long to get to the point, and that they're complaining about the final shot of Rebels that we saw in the epilogue wasn't shown until the end of part 2, to the end of episode 2. And so people are complaining that, they just took too long to set it up and get to the point. And I really gotta wholeheartedly disagree with that. I love when a show takes its time to establish what's going on and give you necessary setup rather than jumping straight into it. And jumping straight into it, especially, again, that's why I don't think it's as alienating to those who haven't seen Rebels as some people claim it to. Had they just jumped into it straight away and started with that scene, then it would have been. So that's my stance. And I actually, even though I hadn't seen Rebels, I appreciate the setup of the new characters and the new situation and establishing what's going on. And I love the action sequences that were in both episodes. They felt very refreshing. In fact, I'm just going to always disagree with the Andor fans, but I don't get that criticism, especially coming from people who love Andor, because those first two episodes were, and in fact the entire show was extremely slow and dragged on for way too long. And those first 3 episodes were so unnecessary. They could have been really crammed into one episode. In fact, a whole season of Andor could have been condensed into like 6 episodes. Whereas I thought the pacing here was perfect. I thought it was pitch perfect pacing. I wouldn't want them to go any faster or any slower. I loved it. And I thought it was all necessary. And then I also heard a lot of people complaining about the dialogue being too slow. Like one person talks and they pause and they wait for the other person to talk and they pause. I didn't notice that. Now maybe because they do that in Rebels or in Clone Wars, and I'm kind of used to that, and maybe that's just Dave Filoni's style. I don't know, but regardless, like I didn't have any issue with that. I thought the dialogue was pretty sharp, and some people saying it wasn't written very well. I disagree. I didn't hear any poorly written dialogue in these 2 episodes. I disagree with that. And so then there's like the opening crawl in the first episode. At first I was thinking, why didn't they do the standard, Star Wars movie crawl? And I think there's a couple reasons for that, even though I was expecting to see that at first. And but there's a couple reasons. First of all, I think those are reserved for the movies, and specifically the episodic, the episode 1, 2. I don't think they've done those outside of those 9 episode movies. And so I think they're specifically reserved for that, which makes sense. And also, I don't think it would fit the tone of what they're going for Ahsoka. I think they're going for a tone that's slightly different than the Star Wars movies. But the wording used in the opening crawl was the language they used was very similar to the grandiose language, the evil trooper, whatever, was very similar to the language used in the opening crawls in the Star Wars movies. So ultimately, even though it kind of surprised me at first, it shouldn't have actually, and I'm sure I'd have a lot of commenters saying, oh, well, of course they're not going to do that, which is the conclusion I came to eventually. It just took me a little bit longer to get there. But yeah, and then we cut to the opening scene, which to me this is the very reminiscent when they go aboard that ship that the 2 bad guys, I had to look up their name, it's like Balin or something, and Balin and his apprentice, whoever that is, Shen, I think. Anyway, the ship that they go on and attack had it was a very obvious nostalgia retro feel to it. It felt like it came right out of the 1980s or the late 70s, very reminiscent of those original trilogy Rebel ships that we've seen, and I really did appreciate that. I think nostalgia baiting can irritate me, especially when stuff like Stranger Things, when they go totally overboard with it. But this, I don't think was overboard. I think it was subtle, but perfect. It was just like the perfect kind of nostalgia baiting. And the scene was kind of very ordinary. I wouldn't want to say cliche, but it's very something we've seen before. The bad guys come on board and the guys on the ship are being very arrogant and, oh, what are you doing? Oh, and the bad guys easily slaughter them and get what they want. But I think that was very effective, even though it was something sort of ordinary and something we've seen before. I thought that was a perfect way to start the show by sort of setting the stage for exactly what who the villains are and what the stakes are. But then you get the scenes of Ahsoka going to the old temple and finding the maps. It's to me was very reminiscent of the Clone Wars and the type of stuff they would do there. And then she had the battle with the droids, which I thought it was some people sort of criticized it for being a bit Looney Tune-ish, the way that she would drill holes underneath them. I actually thought that was pretty cool. I didn't have an issue with that. I thought it was pretty cool fight scene. And then we moved on to the introduction of Sabine. Now, this one I thought maybe was a bit too cliche and overboard with how rebellious she is. Now, it's been a while since I've seen Rebels. About a year, but I only watched the show once. I guess most people would, but again, so I'm not intimately familiar with it, but from what I recall, this was a bit overboard with how rebellious Sabine's character is. Now, I could definitely see people disagreeing with me. Like, I wouldn't be surprised to get comments, oh, she was definitely this rebellious during Rebels. Maybe she was. Maybe I'm just remembering it wrong, or maybe when she was this rebellious in the show Rebels, I thought it was equally as over the top. And I think that is actually more likely. So it was a bit much, the way that she was speeding away. Also, they just wanted to have her at the ceremony. Like, I get her, like, hiding from the ceremony and not wanting to be there, but the fact they went overboard with her, like, speeding away on the speeder and, like, almost colliding with the ship in order to get away from it, that was a bit much. Although, one thing I had to point out, I really did appreciate that they had Clancy Brown play the same character that he voiced in Rebels, because he did look kind of similar to that character. And even when I was watching Rebels, I referred to that character as Clancy Brown because that's all I thought. So glad they actually had him play it. It was cool to see him there. But anyway, so yeah, I thought that introduction was over the top, but I liked when we saw Ahsoka meet up with Sabine and the kind of sort of hostile relationship that they had. And Sabine later on would be like, oh, she didn't come to me, it wasn't her first instinct, it was suggested by someone else. And she's kind of right. But they were talking about how Sabine tried to be her apprentice, and I don't remember this happening. And I watched like all these explained videos, which I was hoping would explain to me what they were referring to, but no one really touched it. So what I kind of gathered is that this is lore that they're creating for this show that we hadn't seen before, that supposedly took place, in between Rebels, because the epilogue of Rebels takes place several years after the bulk of the show. I think the bulk of the show, if I remember correctly, takes place before New Hope, and then the epilogue takes place after Return of the Jedi. So they pretty much skip over the entire trilogy. And if I know my lore correctly, which I'm not intimately familiar, I'm not making all these explained Star Wars videos or whatever. As I say, I'm more of a Trek guy. But if I remember correctly, this is like 5 or 6 years after Return of the Jedi. So it's been a while. It's been a long time. Now, again, more of a Trek fan. But anyway, so yeah, there could have been this failed apprenticeship that they're referencing that just happened off screen, and I'm fine with that. I was just a little bit confused at first of what they were referencing, because I actually don't remember there being that much interaction between Sabine and Ahsoka in Rebels. Again, it's been a while since she's seen the show. Maybe there was, but from my recollection, Ahsoka was really only in season 2. And then she had a brief, cameo appearance at the end of season 4, when Ezra pulled her out of time and saved her life or whatever. So, yeah, I don't remember there being that much interaction between these two characters. So that's where I felt a little bit lost, like I was watching Serenity. And so I feel like maybe they're implying that they had more of a relationship in between seasons, and maybe they did interact more in season 2 of Rebels. I'm just not remembering. I don't know. Anyway, One thing I thought was kind of frustrating to me about these first two episodes, the only real complaint I had, a lot of the complaints these critics have I disagree with and don't think were really, didn't bother me at all, but the one I had that no one else seemed to have is that the fact that the plot, particularly of the second episode, exists because Sabine fucked up and was being rebellious for no good reason. The fact that she, Ahsoka specifically told her to not leave her ship with the map, and that's exactly what she does. And guess what? The map falls into the hands of the bad guys, and it's really all her fault. So really, in the second episode, when Ahsoka is like being really sort of pissy with Sabine and not wanting her to come along and not wanting to work with her, I totally agree. Like, I am side completely with Ahsoka here. Sabine is the one that created this situation in the first place. They would still have the map if she didn't fuck off and get it stolen. Now, you can say, well, she unlocked the map too. Well, surely she could have done that on Ahsoka's ship. And at the very least, like, don't sneak off and defy precisely what Ahsoka told you to do. Like, that's just a dick move. And I wouldn't really want her along on my mission either if I were Ahsoka, being completely honest. So that was the one thing that did kind of irritate me, because the whole, plot of episode 2, the whole, plot of them trying to get the map back is only a result of the fact that she fucked up so badly anyway, in an obvious way, by being too rebellious. But again, so speaking of episode 2, again, I like this, even though it was, that thing that kind of bothered me, but it wasn't that big of a deal. I still really enjoyed this episode as well. It was interesting to get more backstory on the bad guys, Balin or whatever, and seeing Ahsoka work with Hera to try to recover the map and going to the shipyards. Now, one thing I gotta point out is the dude who played the guy who's running the shipyards, who only cared about money. I can't remember the character's name, but he was on House MD. He played a doctor. He was one of the, House's supporting doctors. He was in for the last 3 or 4 seasons. Was it Taos or Towel or something that started with a T? Anyway, as soon as I saw him, I was like, hey, it's the guy from House. And for the rest of the time he was on screen, that's all I could think of him. I was like, well, aren't you gonna diagnose your patient and tell House, who come up with a crazy theory, what are you doing messing around with Ahsoka? Get on to that. Anyway, but I actually thought he was really good in this role, kind of perfect for it, because it was kind of the greedy businessman or whatever, which I kind of buy. And I liked how I actually absolutely loved the scene where they figured out that what ship was on, he was trying to be like, oh, it's classified. And to be honest, I wasn't sure that he was in on it. It was obvious that all the other people in the control room were, just like by the way they were looking, glancing when Hera and Ahsoka were insisting that he tell them. I actually thought that maybe he wasn't in on it and wasn't aware of what the people he was working under were doing, but then when they showed him in handcuffs at the end of the episode, they made it clear that he was. I was like, oh, okay. I thought they could have went the other way, that he wasn't, but they made it clear. And I do like the line where Ahsoka points it out, where Hera is saying, oh, why are they loyal to the Empire? And it's like, she's like, no, it's not loyalty, it's greed. Like, they're just getting paid for it. And I think the commentary they're making about how money, because the guy was like, oh, you worry about the politics, I'm just concerned about money, but then money can affect politics and can affect people to do things that are worse or that are bad for society overall, because they're more concerned about getting money. And so I appreciated that. I thought that was pretty interesting. And the fight scene here, I did really, really like. I liked how Ahsoka had to fight those the robot and that other dude who has a name I can't remember with lightsabers as the ship got away, and we got to see Chopper being Chopper. I feel like, I don't know if this was the way in Rebels, but I feel like when Chopper was doing it, I could hear what he was saying, because he was like, the tone and the inflections and the way he was doing his was obvious. Like, sometimes it was very obvious, like, words that it was like saying, but it was like, instead of pronouncing the words correctly, it's just like the sounds of the words, like saying, when he goes "found it," was actually saying, obviously saying "found it." And I don't remember it that way being in Rebels. Maybe it was, and I just didn't notice. But I did think that was pretty cool. I can almost, like, with R2-D2, like, I had to infer on what he's saying, because he's just doing random beeps. I think every once in a while you could understand, like, you get the same cadence of a word and you can get it. But for this scene with Chopper, it was like every sound he was making was, I could make out the words. But, which I actually kind of liked, because I was able to follow it a bit more. As like when he accused her of going through his stuff, and he obviously said, "Yes, you did." But anyway, so yeah, that was all cool. Saying when they implanted the tracker on the ship. And the ending, again, we catch up to the end of Rebels, where Sabine decides to go with. And I do like that little pep talk that that android. I'm not that huge on the android. I don't remember him very well from the Clone Wars. If I do recall, he was in episodes I didn't like, and I didn't really care that much for this android. But I like him so far in this show. I think he's good, voiced by David Tennant, and I think he adds a little something to the scene. And then we get the scene with him convincing Sabine to take up the apprenticeship, even though he points out, rightfully so, that she's not very effective. She's not force sensitive. She's not very effective with the Jedi, but it still doesn't mean that she shouldn't be one, especially in this day and age. So it's very interesting. So I thought that was very effective. So now let me talk about a couple theories. Someone was hyper-focusing on that witch. Oh yeah, by the way, the character who we saw in Season 2 of Mandalorian, she reappears here, and it's confirmed that she's one of those witches that we saw in Clone Wars, which, okay, that's fine, that's cool. I'm not that excited about it, but it's cool, like, I like it, but I'm not going to make a big deal of it, like a lot of reviewers are tending to do. But anyway, she had a line where she said something like, communicating with Thrawn through space and time. And so a lot of people are suggesting more sort of time travel, because it's already been done in Rebels with the world between worlds, whatever. So people are like, ooh, could it be time travel? In my pie in the sky, I think the showrunners pretty much confirmed they're not going to do this, but I still have this hope that they pull a sort of Star Trek 2009 and create another timeline that's different from the sequel trilogy, and they wipe them out of existence, and they could still do that Rey movie that will follow the sequel trilogy, but it would exist in its own sort of Kelvin universe type timeline. And in this storyline with the Mandalorian and Ahsoka and all that, will create a new timeline going forward and erase the sequel trilogy. I almost want them to do that, but I know they're not going to. But a boy can dream, can he? Like, don't take that away from me. Anyway, and the other theory I was gonna mention was the theory that masked dude, whose name I can't remember, because I don't think they even said it in the show. It's just critics were bringing it up in reviews. But that character, there was a theory I heard that character is actually Ezra Bridger, who's kind of sort of brainwashed by the witches or whatever to be a bad guy. Problem is, I think that theory does hold a lot of water. I could definitely see them doing that. Do I want them to do that? Absolutely not. I totally do not want them to do that. I think that would be dumb. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying if they did that, then the show would be ruined. I'm sure I would just go with it and the show could probably still be great. But I really don't want them to do that. I just don't like that idea at all. But I could totally see them doing that, though. And that's the problem. I think that would kind of deflate a lot of things, and it's kind of cliche. It's kind of a thing done before as well. Winter Soldier, anyone, anyway. But so yeah, I'd rather they not do that. Anyway, yeah. So that is going to be it for my review for the first 2 episodes of Ahsoka. So my rating, which I'll just give for both episodes together, I'm not going to do them separately, out of 10 is going to be a 9. Excellent. I really enjoyed this. I love all the lightsaber fightings. I think this is the kind of Star Wars adventure using Jedi and magic that I've been wanting to see personally. I'm sorry, but Andor was boring, and I'd much rather see this. And in fact, I think I'm going to like this better than The Mandalorian as well, because this is more straightforward, lightsaber, force using. This is what I want out of Star Wars. And I think this actually, I'm more interested in this than I am in the sequel trilogy. I think that as I was watching, I'm like thinking to myself, this is better than the sequel trilogy. Personally, I'd rather see this in The Force Awakens, but I'm not expecting many people to agree with me in that regard, but I loved it, and I thought this was a great setup. I thought it was absolutely necessary. I didn't think it dragged on too long. I had no issue with the dialogue. Could it alienate some people who hadn't seen the shows before? Sure, absolutely. But I think it's still, in the same way Serenity was, it's still self-contained. And seeing those other shows, yeah, it will give you a better feeling of these characters and maybe more attachment to these characters, but it's not necessary to follow the plot of what's going on here. And I think they did a good job of it. And I disagree with those who say this is only for the diehards. I think anyone can enjoy this show. Although the diehards will definitely enjoy it a lot more. I think that's definitely the case. But yeah, I fucking loved it. Going with a 9 though, because they were set up. I'm not going to get too ahead of myself and give it a 10. But absolutely loved it. And as I said, this is the first Star Wars show that I'm going to be reviewing weekly. Most of the other Star Wars shows, I just waited till the season was over because I'm more of a Star Trek guy. I've always said this, and if you know my channel, you know this. But I'm just that excited for this show. This is probably the one show, even more so than Stranger New Worlds Season 2 or Lower Deck Season 4. This is the one show I was most excited for this year, easily. So I'm definitely going to be covering this week to week. So be sure to join me for that. And check out my channel if you are into Star Trek. Got a lot of Star Trek videos going on covering The Next Generation. At the moment, episode by episode, and also we'll be covering Lower Decks when that starts in a couple weeks. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.